first team in final, or the first team in opening government is the team from University of Nairobi C. This is comprised of Jane Baraza and Randy Mugambi. In opening opposition, we have another team from the University of Nairobi, Michael Awimbo and Ramon Joe. Then in closing government, the first Kenyatta University team in the finals, John Mwendwa and Zachary Mbeke. And then finally, the last team, CO, the team from the University, USIU. This is made up of Francis Mwangi and Michelle Wangari. Francis Mwangi and Michelle Wangari. So those are the guys who made the finals for KUDC 2025. I want to announce the motion because the round begins in the next 5 minutes. The motion for finals is as long as ever. It has a really long info slide. So let me read it so that even when the debate begins, it doesn't sound really confusing. The info slide reads, for purposes of this debate, Afro-pessimism is defined as a critical intellectual framework that views Africa as structurally disadvantaged within global systems, emphasizing how historical exploitation, ongoing neocolonial relationships, and systemic marginalization continue to limit African development despite surface-level progress indicators. While Africa Rising is defined as optimistic international narrative that celebrates Africa's economic growth, technological innovation, and emerging middle class as evidence of the continent's transformation into a global economic powerhouse. For purposes of this debate, Afro-pessimism is defined as a critical intellectual framework that views Africa as structurally disadvantaged within global systems, emphasizing how historical exploitation, ongoing neocolonial relationships, and systematic marginalization continue to limit Africa development despite surface-level indicators. While Africa Rising is defined as the optimistic international narrative that celebrates economic growth, technological innovation, and emerging middle class as evidence of the continent's transformation into a global economic powerhouse. The finals for KUDC reads, this House supports the rise of Afro-pessimism in Africa over the Africa Rising narrative. This House supports the rise of Afro-pessimism in Africa over the Africa Rising narrative. By 4:50, the speakers will be in the hall and ready to begin. The judges are also informed so that the round can begin quickly.
Right, I'm hoping this is audible. Oh, okay, good. So first of all, I'd like to give a few shout-outs. I think the first and most important shout-out goes to God for making us get here. Second shout-out goes to my lovely and able partner, Baraza, we've never actually really partnered before. This is actually the first time partnering with her. It's something we've been talking about for a minute, so I'm glad to see that we've made it this far. That's definitely something to talk about. Of course, shout-outs to my other long-term partner, Awimbo. Last year we made finals together, and this year we've also made finals together, however, with different partners. Ideally, we've even exchanged partners, so this is definitely something new. And of course, shout out to the one and the only UNDA for an amazing show out of performance. You guys are definitely doing something crazy in this circuit. And of course, shout out to everyone listening, to everyone who, of course, is interested in the sport. At one point, couple of years back, damn, I'm growing old, was in the same sport as you, watching other people and wondering, when will I get there? So I'm hoping that I'm only a paragon of the person you want to be when you grow in this sport. And with that, my speech starts in 3, 2, 1. Madam Chair, Afro-pessimism isn't just a narrative, it's a calling. And here's why. Colonial powers and colonial governments will never have anyone else's interest at heart but themselves. They have peddled their own foreign currencies as the world lifeline while fueling a debt addiction to African countries. They use their own institutions to likely bear down on African countries after coming to your own countries, getting resources from them, and then going back to their own countries and developing their own countries away from the cycles of development, which essentially principally belong to you. They likely take that away from you, and they will kill, hurt, and do everything possible to be able to bear down on you. That's the very simple framing that this debate needs to start from. But anyway, it's a narrative. Let's actually get down on what exactly a narrative looks like. So first of all, what do you see when you talk about like Afro-pessimism? We think you see like social media posts about like this narrative, the TV talk shows, the news on mainstream media, the billboards, road paintings, and graffiti in the cities. What you hear music, podcasts, radio shows, people's opinions in the streets, and all these things. What do you read? The literature around it, and all these things. Now, who created this message, and what are the incentives? It's very simple. The African people. Why? For the last 60 to 100 years, they've been victims of colonial oppression, victims of pain, anger, hurt, and like grief, and all these things, simply because something that was initially theirs was taken away from them forcefully. But then generally, what are the incentives? They simply want to see all that go away. What is the setting or the platform for this message? We think Africa for the longest time has existed being the poorest economy within like the entire globe for several reasons. They've actively taken minerals away from you and all these things. But then B, to the extent that this realization needs to become important of how bad this problem is, it's essentially important that you likely raise like the Afro-pessimism narrative, and we're gonna talk to you about like why essentially this is important. First argument on like why essentially this rise, or like first of all what this rise essentially looks like. We think the rising prevalence of this looks like there's a lot more of these messages being likely channeled on all platforms that people likely access. So on both sides of the debate, access is not anything we're gonna be talking about. First argument, right? We think you likely increase levels of spreading of information of how bad the problem stems in Africa. Here's the way up on this debate. If you take their narrative, right, at its best case scenario, what you likely end up is with an escapist narrative. Here's why. Escapism exists to exist like as a principle harm to like justify why you may be doing some level of like, you may be doing good in some level of way, but in reality, you are really running away from the reality of how bad the problem is. What exactly then is this problem that you're likely running away from? Undemocratic nations and their existence in Africa likely only bears down on the problem of poverty and all these things. But then B, low levels of education also likely means you have reduced access to like awareness and all these things. But then 3, low accountability demand from these people to their government. Opposition pushback is likely going to be very simple. Well, you guys are likely doing something. Congratulations. We can maybe go back, take shots after this, but that's okay. We don't think that's the real way to deal with these problems. Here's why. You likely run away from what the problem actually is. You reduce awareness to the extent that Africa exists in a state of low poverty, of low education, and a lot of people being unemployed. You likely just end up with busy bodies running away from the problem on their side of this debate. Moving forward on the first argument of my speech, we think this narrative increases the long-term sustainability of social movement. First justification for this, we think the narrative by itself reduces fragmentation. Another problem that Africa exists in right now is the very idea of like divisions in terms of levels of priorities. Here's the mechanism for this: pressure. Even if like this narrative like may gain a little bit of traction at first, they quickly divide. Here's why. There's a difference of priorities that likely exists to the extent that that's also likely a problem that is shown by how bad the narrative looks like with Afro-pessimism. We think the rise of Afro-pessimism essentially becomes important in status quo, and the reason behind that is very simple. People are more likely to unite to the extent that they already agree that this narrative is affecting us all. To that extent, they likely create a hierarchy of needs to address them in status quo, and the main mechanism, or rather the main impact of that is very simple. You likely reduce fragmentation in terms of like the social movements that people have in status quo. But then secondly, moving on from that, is the very idea that social movements that also exist within status quo also are more likely to like get another message that also channels them further to push for more accountability away from their governments. I'll take closing opposition for the purposes of engagement. Chair, we think the current Pan-Africanist movement exists as another narrative to further back this narrative to the extent that it's likely important that we also harmonize the messages that both narratives have, because it's very simple. Both narratives want one thing: Africa's future to exist in the best set possible and gain better geopolitical power and all these things. To that extent then, the understanding of the unique priorities that need to be addressed by
by like both narratives are likely better addressed with Afro-pessimism, simply because you get a better understanding and more urgently of how bad these problems are. But moving on to my second argument, do you think the narrative raises the opportunity cost of starting rival narratives that will try to counteract that narrative? Here is why. Key mechanism. We think activists on either side like may believe that they can reasonably outcompete each other. Here's why that's unlikely true. Also another further answer to that POI. It's a very simple mechanism in that we tell you the hierarchy of needs of what needs to be addressed in general is likely better addressed with Afro-pessimism, because once you understand of how bad the problem is, you'll address the unique problem which is facing everyone being first, and then everything else follows after. But then moving on, we think that narrative also just generally receives more participation. You get to join with other existing narratives like Pan-Africanism, and also just basically means you get more participation. Why is this true? Mechanism behind this. To achieve change, you need a critical mass of people to support the cause. To that extent, that people likely already buy into this narrative because of the problems they exist in, and they understand how bad they need to solve these problems and how fast and urgently they need to solve this. Three impacts to that. They're likely to become more accountable to their governments through things like protests and all these things. These things already exist in status quo. That's fine. But to the extent that they've been largely ineffective, the narrative acts as a charging message, because it reminds people, hey, you are poor. If you don't do anything, you are damned for life. People before you have been dead simply because they didn't do anything. If anything, this is probably the narrative that will actually lead you to be able to get some level of change while you're still alive. Take a very simple message, which is this. Afro-pessimism is the key to emancipating Africa as a unique narrative that uniquely charges people towards whatever is best for Africa's future. We rest from opening government. Here.
Okay, shout-outs are in order. God is good all the time. That is his nature. That's why I'm here. Second shout-out is to Awimbu. He literally carries you through tournaments. Third shout-out is to me for sticking through it, because Awimbu would tell you a week ago we were not supposed to do this tournament, but we are glad that we are here. Last shout-out to UNDA, Budding Society. We're looking forward to seeing you also on this stage sometime. Back-to-back national finalist is in the CV right now. Okay. Oh, this time I'm gonna win it. Last time I didn't. Okay. I'll begin in 3, 2, 1. These guys are gonna fall through the same trap they did in prelims. They don't understand the nature of how sides can be symmetric or asymmetric. The narratives influence people in the same way. The thing that you're going to ask from opening opposition is the fact that if narratives judge people, is it better for this to be a pessimistic narrative or an optimistic narrative? The rise of narrative, how they likely look like, status quo, 3 levels to this to just analyze this. The prominence of this, grassroots levels, it's either dissent or approval. They look at the government, whether they publicly trust or distrust the institutions that institute laws and policies that put them in place. Second thing, people's choices and voting patterns reflect this. They actively know what can truly change and can actively change their lives. And thirdly, the proliferation of things like the media. It influences what you see in terms of documentaries, how they paint Africa, how they paint the home that you live with, and how they paint things that can actually change. This then begs a simple question. How Africans or how human beings then interact with this narrative becomes something that's particularly important. You have to understand the nature of human beings and that type of thing. We say from opening opposition that human beings are wired to react highly to high arousal emotions. The content that provokes people gets shared more quickly and widely. This means that things like joy would be shared more quickly, things like sadness would be shared more quickly, things like pessimism would be shared more quickly, and that type of thing. These things are going to spread to the extent that there's widespread acceptance through things like, even if you don't care about it, you're just sharing things to perform, like to your friends, to your society, and that type of thing, just for you to seem morally righteous. This is what people interact with on a day-to-day basis. To the extent that this becomes your normalcy, this is what people come to believe, and that type of thing. It begs 2 questions that are important to this debate that would be answered by opening opposition. Which narrative is better for Africa? 2, how does this narrative influences other people's actions? First argument. We think that Afro-pessimistic narratives, or the rise thereof, encourages people to disengage with the systems that they're supposed to change in the first place. To the extent that you feel like you're structurally immobilized. Things like capitalism in the countries that you exist, you believe that women in your country cannot ascend to corporate ladders because of systemic barriers. Neocolonialism, you feel like the legacy effects of colonialism, you still face them on a day-to-day basis. If you are born in Congo, you are essentially, I was gonna curse, but if you're born in Congo, you probably aspire to be the biggest, like the person who's in charge of other miners and that type of thing. Your only option in life is to probably be a miner because you are colonized perpetually and you cannot get out of these kinds of situations. This is your current reality. But why is this particularly harmful? A, it undermines the legitimacy of the existing system. Why? Democratic principles, which they think are supposed to change the system, rely on a belief of participation. To the extent that you believe that you cannot change your system through things like participation, protest, etc., they are futile because the system is corrupt on their side of the house. No matter what you do to these people, they are not going to change. If people stop voting, engaging, or assume all politicians are the same, these things are like, it's a systemic problem, the system loses legitimacy, and therefore two outcomes primarily follow, right? This means then that A, people would probably, this is why things like politicians who vote for populist narratives inherently fly within status quo. Politicians who tap into charisma to sort of vote, to make sure people vote for them, and these types of things. This is how people get strawmanned and this kind of things. This little hope that they give you that they can change your system. To the extent that this does not change your perceived reality, this is why you'll keep falling into these kinds of traps and these types of things. Populist strongmen are likely to rise. The only I can fix it narratives are likely to rise because you believe that this leader, they are coming with a new angle, a fresh angle, but to the extent that the problems are still the same, this is why people would probably go for handouts so that they can vote for a particular leader because they're short-termistic in nature. This then means that the other outcome that will probably likely to follow is that Afro-pessimist narratives then fuel things like political instability that happen in the first place. To the extent that there's this tension between the system, this tension of something you can't inherently solve, this is what pushes people to consistent riots. You riot, again, the pressure goes down. It comes back again to the extent that you're not dealing with the root of the problem and that type of thing. The way for this argument then becomes particularly simple. Irreversible harm that happens to the extent that these people believe deeply within themselves due to the rise of these pessimistic narratives that their situation can't inherently change. You block yourself or you lock yourself out of inherent solutions that you can probably have. Second mechanism of why probably Afro-rising is better, right? Because of the same mechanism. If you believe that Africa, this is where Africa is right now, people are growing, you are working to change the neocolonial legacy, you are structurally not okay, but at least this is where you are and these are the weaknesses that you're willing to solve. To the extent that you're starting from a particular baseline, you know that you're poor, but you're working towards it. This is how people best get engaged with their system. This is how people get more involved in the system that legitimizes the level of change that happens. And this is important because any change that can happen has to be weighed on whether it can be long-termistic or not. This then means then that if policies in our side of the house engage with these policies in a way that they believe these policies can actually transform their lives to the extent that they continuously engage with these systems and that type of thing, they believe that we think then that these policies will likely be long-termistic and last in nature. Look at what happened in Rwanda. The genocide happened. They had to pick up the pieces and look at Rwanda right now. Technological innovations, how they continuously believe that their country is continuously evolving. We were not okay. We were killing each other. But right now, we are moving towards technological development. Look at the flying taxis that they've recently brought up and that type of thing. They are continuously evolving. This is how Africa actually has economic development as opposed to pessimistic narratives that they can't inherently change. The impact of this on our side of the house is that this is exactly how it transforms transform the continent to a global economic powerhouse. You don't get the convenient escapism that becomes flipped, and that's a harm on their side. You don't have populist leaders that can just prop up and tell you that they can solve your problems because you can't continuously interrogate them to the extent that you believe, and the media continues to affirm to you that your world is shit and you are fucked at the end of the day if you believe in a pessimism. Here.
Okay, I hope I'm audible. Yeah, so hi everyone. First, shout out to God. It's been God throughout. Second, shout out to my amazing partner, very brilliant. I could have not made it this far if it was not for Andy. Third, shout out to University of Nairobi Debate Association. You all are amazing. Just to mention, so the first KUDC I did, I was a novice and I won the novice trophy. I skipped the second KUDC. I'm in the third KUDC and I'm here to take the open trophy. Okay. Oh, also shout out to Opening Opposition, University of Nairobi. Glad to have you guys as our competitors. And to everyone who made the finals. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, fresher. When Ibrahim Traore fights for the sovereignty of Burkina Faso and PLO Lumumba calls for African nations to wake up, it is due to the realization that African states are falsified to believe in a vision that is crippled by structural deficiencies, something that Opening Opposition are losing out within this debate. This looks like Equatorial Guinea's assets being seized by the France government because the president actively brags about having international shares and stays complacent in development and instead heavily taxes an already struggling informal economy which funds the government's escapades, or opting to build highways in regions that only the elite access, yet the majority population is in informal settlements that they can barely access. But the worst part is that they use these pictures to advocate for tourism within Equatorial Guinea. The impact in this is that you are actively plundering your low-class citizens within this poverty, and that is the problem that having the Africa Rising narrative is going to constantly push towards African countries. What is the problem with Opening Opposition? First of all, we have a POI from closing. They say we do not address how we essentially engage with Pan-Africanism. Let us look at what Pan-Africanism essentially needs. We think the main goal of Pan-Africanism is to call for African states to unite and build a continental economic sustainability with cohesion. The problem why that is not happening at the moment, and that is what PLO cries about in every conference he goes to, is because different African nations prioritize their geopolitical relations differently. This looks like Traore sending out French miners from their country, while Kenyan president using our own taxes to fuel his jets to international travel. So it looks like some countries within Africa want to align with their oppressors, while other countries want to essentially alienate from them. We think this mismatch of cohesion is something that is essentially hindering Pan-Africanism from happening. But why then is the mismatch essentially happening? Now, directly dealing with Opening Opposition. They say, when we choose to ensure, when we choose to push for this level of pessimism, we're either going to get people who are choosing to disengage with governments which are actually going to favor them, not favor them in the long run. But again, secondly, it continuously fuels political instability and riots. Responses to this. I think people riot because people actively choose to riot when their government do not meet the incentives that they are made to achieve. This then looks like, considering last year, if Kenya wants to pass a finance bill that prioritizes renovating the deputy president's house and tax unemployed citizens who barely have jobs that could have been created with this money, we spark discourse by evaluating how our governments have used our resources to achieve their said incentive. We think this is what even helps us to think about our future incentives, how we are going to essentially vote for better leaders who are not going to essentially make us plunder into poverty, considering that is what we're going to do. But again, secondly, how it then the whole idea of how it's going to like reduce disengagement and the whole idea of instability. I think the narrative that exists on their side is essentially pushing for complacency. We think it creates a shift in wanting to address crucial issues. We think Africa will always be propagated to feel poor, and whenever we are being called monkeys on TikTok, we feel bad. It's because we feel like we have the KICC in Nairobi, we have the Times Towers, it is enough for us to say that Nairobi is developed. But that is not necessarily true, because you have Solitei struggling to travel from Rongai on a very bad road. We think then the government is already not being able to address the most important needs. We think the issue with now having Africa Rising then is the whole idea of the sold image that it then has. It then shifts the priority of people being able to essentially focus on a lot of like structural inefficiencies. This then looks like when you want to advocate for people to come and visit Kenya, you want to only show the pictures of Westlands because it has good highways and good buildings, but you fail to show how Turkana fails to even have a good dispensary for women to actively like get responsiveness towards like health issues. It looks like people from Garissa actively standing under trees. What this then means, having Africa Rising ensures a lot of complacency that these governments are really failing to resolve. Why then is it essentially bad for this side? We think that level of complacency is what essentially like pushes for continuous poverty within these countries. Because this is the thing. If you choose to tell countries, okay, it's fine, Africa is rising, we have enough buildings and whatnot, we are well stable and something of that sort. We think it even allows Western countries to strategically choose who they want to engage with. But we think this level of engagement is not always going to be beneficial. What this then looks like, if yes, we say we are going to allow more development to come to our countries, which side are they most likely to prioritize? Improving buildings within Nairobi so that people can actively like get jobs over there. What this then looks like, it then looks like an influx in population within Nairobi. We think an influx in population already informs the government that people only want to like engage in Nairobi. This then reduces the incentive of them wanting to develop other areas that are already like structurally underdeveloped. But again, secondly, is that not like even essentially like respond to the most critical issues that these people essentially face? Before I get into harms, closing. The difference on our side is that we are able to get the real picture and we're able to expand on how we are able to deal with structural inefficiencies. You are able to get development. Where do you get development? On the lucrative side that you've already sold the image to. We get development. How do we get development? You are able to hold leaders accountable. Question the structures that they promised to improve. If they fail to do that, you hold them accountable. Take them out of power. Elect new people who want to like ensure these buildings are actively being propagated. This then looks like when the Kericho governor or the MP is being asked, where is the house that you build for people because you're promising affordable housing? This person built excuses of house. In fact, they actually just looked like toilets. We think this then looks like the whole idea of fallacy is something that is more likely to continuously be propagated on their side. How then does it, we think, how then does African pessimism essentially liberate African nations? We think they start to think of new ways to restructure their development plans that actually fix the systemic struggles that they've always faced. It shifts the mindset from being comfortable with enough buildings in urban areas, yet you have long-standing poor development within like less developed areas. What are the harms that you're more likely to get on their side? A, you continuously reinforce people in power who constantly fail to address the most important issues that people who actually within these global poor countries essentially face. But again, secondly, it even weakens the whole idea of Pan-Africanism. We think this complacency and having different presidents having a mismatch of priorities is what allows different countries to essentially reclaim their own sovereignty, which even like pushes them up economically while other countries continuously plunder in poverty. Reject Africa Rising, support Africa pessimism.
Okay. Yeah, so before I start, I'd like to shout out God for enabling us to be here. I think without him, we wouldn't be here. The next person I want to shout out is Ramon for being an incredibly good partner, UNDA as well, Randy, Baraza, and everyone in finals, the judges as well for doing what you do best. So I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The reason why narratives people believe are important is because they shape how you do a couple of things. Firstly, you see yourself, but then secondly, how the world sees you and engages with you. In my extension, I'm going to explain why Afro-pessimism pushes a negative narrative around African states and why that's harmful for the development of Africa. Before that, I'm going to engage these guys. The first thing I'll engage is the idea of complacency they run. They say it's possible to challenge structures because people riot when they see systems are not working. That is true, and that is where the debate starts from. It seeks to ask us to engage what happens when the narrative rises. So it means the narrative probably exists on either side. So what is the unique impact of the rise? And this is why what Ramon tells you becomes important. The trap of apathy. People see the barrier to access change is very high. This becomes bad because people are unlikely now to look for the change they want. You see that already currently status quo. The world is very sad. Inflation is high. The systems are broken. The narrative that are continuing to rise in your society continue telling you the systems are very hard to break. I think the impact of that, rather than invigorating people to try and pursue change, will make them stop achieve this anyways. Comparatively, when you're told Africa is rising, what happens is you're given hope. You're motivated to continue pursuing change because you see it's possible for it's possible for African states to change. You see that you can have economic empowerment, and I think that's how you fuel people to have advocacy. When you sell them hope and they see that there's likelihood of change. The second thing they talk about is why that's the most effective mechanism of having advocacy. I think again, the same mechanism I give you already explains to you why that's a less effective mechanism for advocacy, insofar as it increases the burden of advocacy by explaining to you why these are actively things that you cannot achieve. I don't think it's enough for people to just show you that your life is extremely bad and that you're going to work towards this. But then secondly, the problem why this causes complacency is that it shifts accountability outwards, and this is how we engage with them. Look at the info slide and see how it frames this. It says the reason why Africa has problems is because of colonialism. So you're always going to have a colonialist mindset and think that your problems are not because of the things that happen within your state. They're not because of the actions within your state, and that's why we don't think they can have that accountability. Comparatively on our world, where we tell you probably the systems are working. So when you engage with your systems, you see the systems are working, but they probably have problems because of the leadership we have, because of our capacity or lack thereof, and that's where you more likely challenge the leadership to change within this debate. So the first extension then is going to be on why we decolonize the African mind and why this is something important. Firstly, the necessity of decolonialization. I think we've explained to you why there is these narratives of why Africa is a bad place are already massive in society, and how they're likely going to affect and increase apathy within society and reduce the incentive of people to engage with voting. The reason why voting does not work in most African states and why democracies are bad is because people see that they cannot change the systems. There is if you interview young people, they tell you the reason why they didn't vote is because they see things are likely not going to change because the systems are very hard to be broken. Things like nepotism are entrenched within too much. But the second thing here on why this is better is on how it recalibrates the African mind. But then thirdly, it reduces the incentives of people to be geopolitically divided, and hence explaining why we get more Pan-Africanism. Note the virtue signaling of this argument. It shows Africans that it is possible to achieve a great Africa. It is possible for us to have economic empowerment. And this is when Africans can look inside. In their side, it's a very divisive narrative, insofar as it tells Africans, you guys are incapacitated alone because the structures are bad. So look for the West because they probably have better structures. This is true because in a narrative debate, again, there are counter narratives. When you look at narratives around the West, they paint them as good areas, thriving areas, and that's why people necessarily view them as places where you can get aid from. That is why we have things like brain drain, because you see that those education systems are the ones that are working. In our side, we maintain that talent because they see that the world is probably a good place. Before I move on to the final extension on the world's view of Africa, I'll engage closing. I'll respond to that later within my speech. But as I continue to my final extension on why the perception of African states by the external world is something significantly important, I think what you uniquely do in our side when there's a rise in Afro-rising, you make the minds of people change about how they perceive Africa. If you watch TikTok, you look at how an American person views Kenya or any African states, they see that as a very underdeveloped place. They see that as a very bad place to live, as a very insecure place to live. The problem with that is that it affects the things like investors' mindsets and things like foreign direct investments, because people who are investing within these countries are afraid to invest there because they see it's probably it's not a secure place to be in. You're likely not going to get return on investments for the things you do. I think that's the harm you have on their side. On our side, where you paint Africa as a great place, as a place that is thriving, thriving, as a place that is becoming the new middle class, the people like investors who care about return on investment and are risk averse, they now are more likely to invest in your countries and increase this investment because they see it's worthy to invest in African states because you're likely going to change the impact of these things in our comparative. I think that shows you why we just likely get more inflows from the external world towards African states. That shows you why we also have and build more capacity for African states to become better by like just intuitive like analysis. If we have more money coming to Africa because people see Africa as a place that is good, you have more money to invest in infrastructure. We have tourism skyrocketing because people are no longer afraid to come to Africa because they see Africa is a good place. They read about these things on like books. They see these things in documentaries, and that's how you shape the minds. And that's why the frame I give you at the top of my speech as to how it influences the value systems of people becomes very important. At the end of this debate, why do we win this debate from opening oppositions? There are two things. Firstly, on the idea of utility, we show you why we are more likely able to recalibrate the minds of Africans, and why this is the most important rallying call for things like advocacy, by extension social movements, by extension how likely you are to break systems. The second thing here is on how we have less irreversibility of harm because we don't perpetuate the harms within the systems. Things like corruption, we are more likely to address these things at the point in time we tell the world to look at us as being the people who drive our economies, people who are doing things within our economies. But then finally, I just show you why we are more likely to make Africa greater on our comparative by how we get things like more foreign direct investments. By extension, that shows you we probably alleviate more poverty, we probably have better working democratic systems by the mechanisms we give you, and we better have like things changing for the betterment of the people. I think again, finally, just why opening governments can't win. I think they establish a false binary and they fail to engage the comparative. If you look at their case, it just establishes why Afro-pessimism is good. They don't engage with the positive matter you get from us on things like the trap of apathy. With all those reasons, proud to oppose, vote OO.
A couple of shout outs. Firstly, shout out to everyone that attended KUDC. I was really happy to spend the 4 days with you guys. It's always, I always enjoy spending time with debaters, public speakers, judges, observers. Yeah, I like this community. So shout out to everyone who came to KUDC. Secondly, shout out to everyone that made KUDC possible, from the organizing committee, Debate Association of Kenya, to the investors like Walter Okello that gave us money for the lunch, the nice food we enjoyed. Thank you for making this possible and, convening young people to discuss about Kenya and Africa. That shout out is to Renson. I promised I would give Renson a shout out, so shout out to Renson. Yeah, and the last shout out is to everyone that actually followed the dress code. You guys look really wonderful. For the rest of us, I promise next time I will have a suit, not a yellow shirt, but yeah. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Why is the narrative that government is defending Afro-pessimism most likely propagated by Africans and not other people? 2 reasons. The first is that individuals have a disconnect whereby they don't like to believe they are bad people. Most people like to believe they are good people because that helps you to sleep better at night. When you believe you are a bad person, that creates a disconnect in your head. The reason this is true is because the reason why this proves this is propagated by Africans is that this narrative criticizes Westerners. It does things like talk about neocolonialism and historical injustices. Westerners are unlikely to criticize themselves for the reason that most people like to believe they are moral. Most people like to believe they are not bad. That's why when you meet German people, they will say, I'm not a Nazi, I never supported Hitler. Nobody wants to be characterized that way. Why is this important? Because this responds to opening opposition's case on the idea that people will disengage from systems because they feel that they can't change anything. Given that this is propagated by Africans and African philosophers, African great leaders and so forth, the incentive that exists within them is not to propagate a narrative that will cause people to move away from the country or to move away from systems. Because when you do that, no change can occur. Their incentives are for people to want to create change. That is to say, the narrative they propagate will not be a narrative that says your country is in a mess, you can't fix the country. It's your country is in a mess, but you can fix the country, do something about it. But the second thing is that that narrative is likely to be nuanced for the same reason. That is, it's not just going to blame everything on Westerners, they're also going to highlight the specific problems that are caused internally by African citizens and African leaders. They have the incentives to make sure this is nuanced because they want change. They know that the only way you achieve change is if it's nuanced as well. Notice, it's not just every Tom, Dick and Harry that is propagating this narrative. You'll have to be somebody that has some form of influence within Africa. So you're probably a great African leader or a great African philosopher, the likes of Vusi Thembekwayo or Julius Malema, people that have influence, people that have the incentives to make this nuanced and that sort of thing, which means a majority of their arguments are likely to not fly in this debate. Why then do we support this narrative? I want to explain how their narrative works like, because there's something I want to make very clear here. You're not going, what is not comparative here? You're not going to stand in front of Africans and tell them they don't have problems. They're going to stone you. They know they have problems. And you don't need to come and remind them they have problems. They see it every day. You are Africans. You see problems every day. You don't need somebody to come and remind you have problems. You don't need to come and paint to them, there's a picture of problems, because that's what opening government says. We want to paint them a picture that there are problems that exist. You don't need to do this. They live in these countries. They know there are problems. They don't need you to come and remind them. What is then the change that happens here? How are these narratives propagated? On both sides, people are likely to accept that there are problems. You can't stand in front of Africans and tell them that they are not problems. They are not stupid. They see the problems every day. What you tell them, the difference on our side of the house is this. On this side, what they tell them is that yes, there are problems, but the systems are working. They are fixing those problems. That is the difference. What happens on government side is you tell these people there are problems, but the systems are not working to solve these problems. Why does this bring change? Firstly, on opposition side, when you tell people there are problems, but the systems are working to solve these problems, what do you tell these people? Number one, the systems will eventually take you there. They will reach the promised land eventually. Allow these systems to continue progressing, you will eventually get to Canaan. Why is this bad? Because systems need constant attention. What you do in their world, because you have already told them systems are working, there's no need for us to give constant attention. They are working. Let them do their job. We don't need to interfere. But why is this bad? 3 reasons. Number one, systems have loopholes. You need to be constantly attending to these systems so that you can notify the loopholes and deal with them. Secondly, systems will always have bad actors coming into those systems. You need attention in order to identify those bad actors, either prevent them from going into the systems or deal with them if they're already in the system. But number 3, you need to constantly examine systems so that you can invest new strategies that take you to the promised land. In their world, where you take away this attention because you have told people systems are working, they will let you there, allow them to do their job, you will take away this attention. What it means, you take away these mechanisms. What then happens most probably is that systems collapse on their side of the house. Because opening opposition is right. They give people hope. They give people hope that they will eventually reach there. And that is the problem. Because when they have this hope, then they have no, they are not then, what is it called, paying attention to this system. And we think this is bad on their side of the house. Why then on our side of the house is it that we get the attention that we need in this regard? Because what tends to happen on our side of the house is that number one, I've already told people systems are not working. They need to deal with these systems. But number 2, there is an intense emotion of anger that you bring up within these people. Why is this true? Number 1, you tell them about historical exploitation, the fact that they underwent slavery, the fact of stealing minerals, systemic marginalization, neo-colonial relationship, and that sort of thing. Why is this important? Number 1, they are likely to fight for the first reason that people want to avoid shame and disrespect. When you told them their ancestors were sold into slavery, that is shame, that is being disrespected. Human nature always incentivizes you to fight back against this. Secondly, is that people don't like suffering. Nobody likes suffering, which means you likely fight back. The counterfactual is you die. Nobody wants to die. But thirdly, there is pain attached to this. You probably want revenge for all that has been done to you. What then does is that you get up and you fight back against this. You invest for this to, for you to get a better tomorrow. But beyond that, we think that being angry is also a good thing, specifically because for you to change these systems, it's not going to be easy, because you need to endure pain, because these systems are going to backlash against you. Why do they backlash against you? Firstly, because there are people who benefit from these bad systems. You're not just going to change them and they will just stand there and think kumbaya and allow you to. You have to fight them back. But number two, a lot of these issues are deep-rooted, which means you need a lot of investment in terms of time, in terms of money, and sometimes you might even have to lose your life. For you to be able to make this sacrifice, you need these people to be happy, not to be happy, to be angry at this, and for you to incentivize them to do things such as shame and that sort of thing. At the end of the day, we think we get the change. Closing government.
I hope I'm audible. First, shout out to God. It had reached a point we never thought we were breaking. It was tough. And shout out to all the teams that are here. I like just highlighting that I love this tournament because there have been so many novices, and I think novices signify growth. I'm very proud of each and every one of you. Please keep doing it. It gets better. It does get better. Third shout out goes to my debate society. It's good not to see you here, but they shall be there next time. Fourth shout out goes to Paul. I think you've done a really good job in UNDA. Props to you. Before I forget, fifth shout out to a very important person in my life, my partner. He's not just my partner, but he's actually just a good friend. So and he's carried me. He's carried me throughout the whole tournament. I couldn't have done this without you, Francis, so this speech is specifically for you, and I hope we win. And to the beautiful panel, during deliberation, remember it's only CO that gave you a shout out. Yes. I shall be engaging. Opening. Just for the extension, I think my partner will engage closing. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think Mwendo is very weird in this debate, because let's look at what the info slide says. The info slide is very, very clear that what necessarily their world has to defend is that this dominant narrative that is very negative. Look at what happens in status quo. The narrative that we see on their side are things like Africa is too poor. Things like, nothing good can come out of Africa. Things like, African degrees can't stand and you have to take an American degree for you to be knowledgeable. And they also push things like what works and what doesn't work. I think our extension is going to be very simple, because I think OO does an okay job trying to show you why this influences individual agency. I'm going to show you why it's better for Africa's economy as a whole. First extension, and something we need to understand. But before that, some characterization on who gets affected the most, because we need to understand that the people who Africa is very reliant on youth, like the youth form majority of the population. That necessarily mean we've seen African youth want to want to embrace these cultures and that kind of thing. They like things like Pan-Africanism. They've started believing in their own country and that kind of thing. So the question is, what does Africa need now? And I'm going to answer that through my first extension. I think the idea is very simple. If pessimism becomes the most dominant public theory, it changes incentives and expectation. What happens is, look at what happens to African youth. They know, they want to better themselves. They want to do things like doing startups. They want to start jobs and that kind of thing. What their side tells you is don't start a startup in Africa. It's unlikely to work. It's unlikely to be better and that kind of thing. So many Kenyan youth are trapped in what necessarily is bad. It necessarily becomes very, very harmful to them, and we think that that's necessarily bad. Because second thing that happens is that investors are unlikely to invest in this kind kind of thing. Because what is pushed is that nothing good can come out of Africa. Even if a startup is coming up, it can't be good, it can't solve the crisis. We need Western people to come and help us. We always need help and that kind of thing. So what necessarily means is that we have reduced entrepreneurship. People are not likely to start entrepreneurship. People are not likely to solve problems. We have things like fewer startups. We think then that also people want to immigrate. People believe that I can only become better when I go work abroad because our country is too necessarily bad, and that necessarily means they're bad. But even if they go there and that kind of thing, that's why they settle for petty jobs, be nannies and that kind of thing, because they don't believe they deserve anything, and that's necessarily bad. We think then that that's necessarily bad, because what you do is that entrepreneurship and tech hubs that depend on clusters. That necessarily mean a few of them means we can't match our talent, we can't match our capital, we'll have to take it elsewhere, and that's necessarily bad. But also secondly, I think investors and founders coordinate on belief. If both expect failure, projects don't just start, and that's necessarily bad. We think then we get worse exploitation. 5th minute, Baraza, I promise I'll take you. The second extension is on why we get better gaining power and why necessarily we get better positioning as Africa. Because the question is, what does Africa need now? We need to set out, we need to alienate ourselves from this kind of trap. We think then that narratives aren't just stories. I think Awimbo does a beautiful job telling you that Mwendo doesn't engage. They shape Africa's ability to negotiate globally. We think then that what happens is when their narrative is pushed abroad, it means then Africans are too dependent, we need to come and help them, and that kind of thing. We think then that African Rising reframes Africa as a partner with urgency. They do believe that this thing, that Africans can trade. They do believe that Africans can do better things. But also secondly, we think you shape your diplomatic posture. If Africa is seen as perpetually weak, we think that things like negotiation, things like trade deals, and they look as charity, what can we give to Africa to survive? That becomes the narrative. But also, what our side does, it now changes the narrative to what can Africa offer and what can we gain by aligning with it. That necessarily means we get better by gaining power. An example of what happened in COP23, African people stood at the table and they said, we don't agree with this budget because we do believe that we don't emit the most, and that kind of thing. We think then, it only works when Africa projects itself as future oriented, and they do believe that they can move on. But also secondly, on why necessarily what happens, because this narrative is pushed in films. You see it in films. Every film that you see is what Baraza tells you. Turukana being very, very poor. You don't see Akina Shamia who are the best lawyers. You see people who don't finish high school and that kind of thing. So what necessarily happens is that the African films and music, fashion that are going to be produced, they are going to be treated as niche. They are going to be treated as oh, this is just developing word art. We don't necessarily have to accrue much value to it and that kind of thing. So what necessarily happens is that these people are able to have just a vast narrative push and that kind of thing. But we think on our side, we're able to push things our films are watched by more people. People like Lupita Nyong'o are claimed better. We think that kind of thing. People are likely to watch things like Nollywood and that kind of thing. But before I continue, Baraza.
These guys can't win on investment. Investors want to look good. If they see you're poor, they're more likely to invest because they already believe we have potential. Savior complex means you get more investment based on their own mechanism.
I think that's why those same investors are likely to exploit you, because they do believe you're not good enough, you don't deserve this, you're structurally poor, and that's why exploitation is worse. Then, necessarily, why narratives necessarily determine, why do we necessarily get better African unity? Because this is what these guys tell you, that, people want to engage with their colonizers. That's the same worse mentality, because I don't believe Uganda is good enough, I don't believe Tanzania is good enough, I don't believe these other countries are good enough, I'm unlikely to engage with them. I'm likely to say, the USA is the best country, they have better deals, even if they exploit me, it's fine. I don't want to engage with these countries that are seen as corrupt and failing. We think then what happens is African states distract each other. Leaders fear association. Things like the African Union is unlikely to occur. It becomes structurally worse. We think then that Pan-Africanism is likely to rise, and that's necessarily bad. We tell you, this is why our extension is very important. Because what O's argument stops here. They just tell you about investment and individual. We show you why Africa is able to have on a better global scale, but also too, why African youth better themselves. And I think my partner will continue on this. Never been prouder to win from closing opposition.
Yes, before I start my speech, let me thank God for place tumefika so far. Missing round one, being in finals is not an easy joke. It reminds me 2 years ago when we took the trophy for KUDC1. So at least my fellow competitors should know that my name is on the trophy already. But because of what they have argued, they're forcing me to take it for the second time. And I came to train. I'm starting in 3, 2, 1. When this round of these tournaments was starting, I think I told you, Madam Chair, that people have tendency of blaming West Africans for our own problem. That is the same thing these people are still doing. But the second thing, I asked my good friend Awimbo, why should you give a beggar wearing a suit 10 bob? And therefore, he refuses to answer me. The reason why I was asking that question was quite simple. They tell you that they already agree that we are beggars, we are suffering, but we need to tell people that we are successful. That is like being a woman without money and wearing a suit, and then expect some people to give you cash. That is problematically wrong. But first of all, let me deal with CEO as I come to. There's no bench here you can vote to be number one in this bench. CEO gives us a very, like they come here and throw things. One thing they say, that all youths in Kenya, all youths in Africa have passion of Pan-Africanism. No analysis, no mechanization. Youths have different things. There are some people want to go climate change. There are some people want to go AI. But even to that particular extent, the greatest thing that disappoints me with them, because if you want to go AI, most of them, it means compare themselves with AI techs. That is, you have to give mechanism of that. But there are things that they say here that they don't mechanize. One, they tell you that if you spread the narrative that we are spreading, then it changes the incentives and the expectation. I think this is the much more reason why we are pushing this. We want to change the incentive of the young people or the Pan-Africanism movement by telling them that we are not good yet, the way they are saying that we are good. We need to push them and radicalize them against this particular system. We think this thing is good for us. They needed therefore to explain why changing the incentive of someone is bad. Fake mechanization, fake analysis, you cannot rank them by that. But second thing that they say in this debate, this is quite funny. Listen to this. They say people want to migrate because of this narrative. This is the much more important thing why we are pushing for this particular narrative. When people are migrating because we are telling them this narrative, it creates conversation of why are they migrating. That is to say, at least there's mechanism of changes starting from our own side. When people start to move and Kenya is starting to have less people, they will have the incentive to change and create those particular narratives that exist with their own state. What happens in their world is this. Kenyans move to Saudi Arabia, they get killed, but we tell them that things are good. You just be there. You are successful. Clap for them. Clap for CEO. But the worst thing is this. They come here and tell you that African will partner with West African nation. What is bad with that? Few things to tell you in this panel. Africa at itself cannot depend on itself. Why? Lack of enough technology for them to be on themselves, and that was thing. One. But two, we think it is the role of West African nation to continue reparating us for the colonization they did to us. It is their role and duty to ensure that we are stable as in our nature. It is not wrong if we partner with them. It is not wrong when they want to reparate us much. The greatest problem is this. When we buy into their world and tell them that we are good, two things happen. One, they will think that the reparation they have given to us is enough. Yet it's not enough. What we are having here is not as much as the mineral they stole from us 50 years ago. What they are giving us today is not as much as the pain and suffering they caused to us 50 years ago. As what we tell our people, that it is still not enough. The reason we are suffering is because some stupid man from British came and stole from my own grandmother. This is the much more reason what pushes this particular British people to continue reparating us so that they can turn this narrative we are pushing into this particular agenda. What opposition wants is telling you that fuck off. Let us tell them that reparation is enough. Let us go with that. We think this is bad, but this is the most amazing thing. Badly enough, they have an economic student. They won't come and invest. Few things. If we sell the narrative that we are suffering, investors are creative people. They will want to look at the problem in those particular African nations, create opportunity and invest on them. In their own world, this is what we're saying. We are already good. we can move, this is the success we've made. What necessarily mean, you make investors not to be creative. What necessarily means is that they don't have the incentive to come and invest anyway, because for you to be a good investor, this is entrepreneurship. You have to create a problem, and after that particular thing, you create a solution to it. This is when you invest. You only invest in nations which problem exists. You don't invest in nations where there's no problem. It is hard for you to invest in the United States of America because everything they have created solutions to those problems. It is good for you to invest in these places because we continue telling you, as much as people have invested, we still have problem. Please, sir, Mr. Walter Okello, invest here, solve for us problem. What they tell these people is quite simple. Don't invest, we are good, we are successful, I'm not taking your POI. But let me go to OO because this is where things are happening. This is what OO says. And this is why you need not to vote OO, even at first runners up. They tell you this. This one encourages people to disengage with the system that needs to change. That this acts as a barrier to accept changes. Few things. One, the system is bad anyway, and they concede that you are already poor as a nation. So what is it? Even if you want to disengage with bad system, I can lazily argue with that because they also lazily argue. But secondly, even if analysis is that people lose interest in voting, we don't think this is bad. It creates conversation. Why do Kenyans went to vote and they did not vote? At least you will give the incentive for those leaders taking into power to at least create an incentive to change so that people within this particular nation follows the same system and better the system. For them, they tell you, let Ruto fuckingly steal money from you and you just keep quiet and sit down. We are good. We have achieved it. We are already at the top. Fake, don't vote them in. But this is another thing. The next thing they say is that we want a narrative that can last long and a long-term narrative. What a fucking long-lasting narrative without change. As we want, even if it is a short term, but change is approved, well and good and us. Longevity, you cannot argue in a final in this debate. That leave for novices. But next thing is that populistic leaders, but thank God they just mentioned it. There's no need for me to rebut that. They don't even analyze it. Then the next thing is investment. I've gained that when I was engaging the cases of CO. Few things. Why is OG out of this debate? OG says this. The problem is long-term sustainability of social movement. They say how activists can compete with one another, and narrative means more participation. Response one, we don't think if these are mutually exclusive. Those things you can achieve in both worlds either way. But secondly, opposition can still also achieve those things that we are saying. But thirdly, the remaining case just shows the bad Africa, and as they don't mechanize how Africa can move to change, because they only tell us that African is bad. Oh, you tell them how undemocratic nations are, how low level of education we are, and such things. They don't mechanize for us how if you push this narrative, we will urge us to change and move these particular things. We think that they are wrong. The only people who should be voted first in this debate, mark you me, just like Shamia in Olympic, the last time I attended Olympic, I am winning from CG for the first time. The quite simple analysis we gave you from CG on how if you radicalize people and you tell them that those people are the reason why we are poor, you make them to push for change. But secondly, on the old ideology that someone cannot change when they're on the comfort zone. If you tell them that you've achieved, they cannot push themselves to the greatest wall. But on the third thing is on that simple analysis that we give you from the CG, that if you want to push for change, therefore you have to act as a victim for people to help you. Don't be like a woman without money and wearing suit. Thank you.
Assuming I'm still audible, I'm not usually proficient with mics, so I prefer using my own voice, but for today, Tabidin Meza. I'll sort out my notes as I do my shout-outs. Firstly, I would like to thank God, because honestly, there was a very, very high likelihood I wouldn't have done this tournament on Wednesday. Yes? We were almost dropping out of the comp, but here we are at finals. Secondly, I would like to shout out to my partner. She has been carrying me in this debate ship for the past year. She carried me to my first final. Hopefully we can get our first win together and not become Arsenal, constantly runners up. Okay, in the process, I would also like to shout out to my society, or the societies that made me who I am, but I was saving that for puns when I make it to finals. But anyway, I would like to shout out the USIU Spoken Arts and Debate Society. We're a small group, a bunch of clowns, but we are really committed, really dedicated, and one of the best, if not the best. So to all of them, judging, public speaking, guys reading for the exams, I cherish you guys a lot. Lastly, shout out to myself. This is my first KUDC. Missed KUDC 1 due to exams and classes, missed KUDC 2 due to again classes and lack of a partner, and KUDC 3 made it to finals, otherwise Baraza wouldn't have gotten a novice trophy. But anyway, I'll show why she doesn't deserve an open trophy in the first place. I'll start pure preferences, OG. Anyway, it's also funny that Mbeke said he's going to win from CG with Shaman or Shamia's partner. So, skill issue. I'll show also why they don't deserve to win. I think enough with the personal attacks. This is going to be the most important 7 minutes. So guys, please, I need your undivided attention. Kindly, need your undivided attention. 7 minutes, that's all I beg. Probably 6 minutes because that's all I need. And I'll try my best not to rap. Okay, assuming I'm still audible, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, there's one key thing that said government in its entirety has failed to consider. They don't know what literacy is because they didn't read the info slide, for crying out loud. They haven't engaged with what their burden as government bench was supposed to be. They had 2 simple things to show. 1, why necessarily we have to choose this pessimistic route and circumnavigate any form of development that has happened, maybe making technological hubs, as my partner pointed out, maybe development of new infrastructure, or maybe new economic policies that have literally made Kenya better than it was 20 or 30 years ago. All of that in government's world in its entirety is literally viewed to be flawed and not even important. So this means any form of progressive world that's going to be deemed in government's world isn't important, but instead you'll be that pessimistic emo kid who's only focusing on the negatives on his life and saying the reason I'm not better, it's because somebody else is better than me, I have no incentive to grow. The reason I'm not better, it's because of so and reason A, B, and C. That's basically government's burden and world which they haven't engaged, so you can't credit them on anything. 3rd and 4th respectively, panel. And this is me being nice. So I'll just chat on why we necessarily beat our opening, because they're probably the strongest team in this room apart for us. First piece of extension that you get from my partner and I is 1, you necessarily get the aspect of cultural bargaining power in the notion towards decolonizing. What does this necessarily mean? We tend to see narratives changing the cultural dogma that people consume, interpret, and engage with on a day-to-day basis. What does this necessarily mean, panel? Already in status quo, aside opposition at large, we have considered and even closing government, is that Africa at the moment is largely dominated by the youths. The youths at the moment, they are emboldened. They want to embrace their patriotic nature. They want to embrace their cultural heritage. They want to say, I am Kenyan, I am Congolese, I am African. That's the reason why when you're in diaspora, you're always going to see an African with a Kenyan bracelet. You're always going to see them with a Somali bracelet. You're always going to see them with their home country's bracelet, because they know what their cultural identity and heritage means. So what does this lead to? They mean to buy into said government's world and also our extension on bargaining power. It means that you gain an aspect of cultural soft power being mechanized and being made better in society. So this means 2 economic revenue streams can be made, whereby in the entertainment industries like the filmmaking industry, songs and all that chat can be used to push the Pan-Africanist movement further, can be used to tell people why Africa is beloved, why Africa is better, and why you should care more. At the same time, it also allows the African youth by themselves to believe and breathe and grow. They can say, you know what, in the past my ancestors weren't able to do this, but if Tyler can make it to the Grammys singing Amapiano, I can also find my own way and my own notion to make similar effects and similar prospects within my life panel. So this means any disincentive of saying structural imbiasness are going to be present or they're going to bring me down won't necessarily be feasible on our side. Instead, we'll be pragmatic and rational in nature, whereby if things don't work out your way, you'll decide to say, what, I was already 1-0 because I'm African, but I have a bigger incentive to make sure I'm better because I have hope. I've seen the progressive growth happening, which gives me even more hope, more determination, and more strive to become better, not only for myself, but also for my fellow African society, brothers and sisters panel. On to the second extension, and also why we beat our opening panel, is the key aspect. When you go into an African state, you tend to see these leaders having 2 aspects of notion in their cognitive thinking. 1, I'm going to wait for the white messiah, China, China, EU, US, etc. So this means whenever you have the G5, G20 meetings, you'll be constantly pandering towards the needs of the West and the global North. But the means that you buy into the chart that my partner brought in earlier, not only will our leaders, but also citizens treat Africans as an equal bargaining partner in the global aspect and in the global economic view. What does this mean too? It means when COP20 happened, Africans prior didn't necessarily know what environmental progress and environmental challenges we're facing. But post that, Africans realized the West and the global North need us to this extent, whereby they're willing to go financial consequences and financial expenses to get our needs and to make sure that we are treated well. So what does this lead to into panel in the whole extension? It means 1, we now get our rights. We now get get an equal bargaining chip. We get what we want, we get what we deserve. With these guys, you'll be constantly crying and waiting for a white messiah to give you a grant and a loan with bad austerity measures panel. You need to consider that side OG, CG, and OO can't beat us. So what necessarily do you also get? People are likely to have an aspect of watching us and engaging with our content and culture due to the aspect of patriotism being engaged with. That's why my POA was inherently important. Without the Pan-Africanist movement being inherently there and growing as it currently is, we wouldn't see other narratives like Ubuntu for crying out loud being brought up or being engaged with. What does this lead to, panel? It leads into people understanding that despite our different backgrounds, our different, let's say, mindsets, perspectives, and all that, we have a common front, a common unity point, and something to actually work together and yearn for that can unite us together. But what's the comparative that you get with inside government at large? You have an aspect of fragmentation, whereby Kenya believes it can be the best, wants to be the best, but Congo says the FBI, the West, and state sponsors militia constantly make us down and constantly don't allow us to mine. So what do? I cry about it and don't grow and wait for a white messiah to come for me. So what literally happens? You have two conflicting nations that are resource rich, not working together, but constantly having different ideological fields that are clashing with each other, panel. So this literally means any aspect of unity that's going to be present on their side won't be even feasible, because they already have ideological fragmentation being exacerbated further in their world, panel. And lastly, just to make it inherently clear, dominant narratives pushed through media already show that Africa is too poor. African degrees aren't important. So you already have a bigger incentive in society to give Africans hope and give them a shot to say, shoot your shot and go to the moon. You can become the professor that you want. You can become the astronaut you seek to become. Because the minute you rob them of that hope and constantly tell them, we wait for the neocolonialist movement and pander to the needs of the global north, we won't be better. We'll literally be stuck into the same issues that we pander over and not grow. So for them, it's literally no aspect of long-term stability or sustainability. So, just to summarize, because I pretty much have 1 minute left. Government in its entirety, CG literally had no extension. It's just fatalism. The pessimistic emo kid that just says everything is bad and I don't necessarily care or want to grow, I'm waiting for it to become worse. At best, if you buy CG, they say, you know what, radicalization is going to be happening and all that chat. But remember, you also have to push this narrative, engage with it and all that chat. You can't necessarily buy their case, they deserve a fourth. But what necessarily comes from our substantive matter panel, if I haven't already made it inherently clear on why side CO wins, it's also, remember, the diaspora people are one of the biggest investors in the African market. This literally means African entrepreneurs and people in the diaspora need a bigger incentive to send more remittances and believe it won't be swallowed by corruption or it won't be swallowed by systematic injustices. So the minute that you tell them to buy into pessimism, you're telling them literally stick into that host country that's hosting you, don't care about your home, abandon your African heritage, and literally don't care, don't grow, don't have any development. And with that, I think we have shown you growth has happened, we solve systematic issues, we embrace the Pan-Africanist movement and have our cultural identity in check. CO wins, OO second, government in the bins.